I'll just wait for everyone to join. Okay, brilliant. So yeah, welcome to our final session of today's instalment of Interact Virtual Festival. This session, we'll be talking accessibility capability. Massive thanks to our three panelists who I'll introduce in just a moment, and a big thanks to everyone that's watching too. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box, and Alastair will be fielding as many of those as he can at the end. If there's any issues with audio or anything like that, please let us know in the chat function. Please also say hello to each other there as well. So joining me are Leonie Watson, who's director at Tetralogical, an accessibility engineer, member of the W3C Advisory Board, and co-chair of the W3C Web Platform Working Group, technology writer and speaker. Also Richard Morton, who's head of accessibility at Government Digital Service at the Cabinet Office, and Alastair Campbell, who is co-founder and director of accessibility here at Nomensa and co-editor of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. They'll be discussing accessibility capability, what it looks like in various organisations, and what you can do to move in the right direction. So I'll hand over to Alastair to kick things off.
Thanks, Henry. And yeah, we're looking at accessibility capability in organizations. There are a few organizations that we, as a sort of group of panelists, have looked at, and well, we get involved in various organizations. Richard is a particularly good person to have on today as head of accessibility at GDS, which certainly when I go around talking to various clients, we hold up as, here's an organization that is very mature from a sort of accessibility capability point of view. I'm not going to say that too many times if I can help it. So Richard, I was wondering if you could maybe kick us off with what are the aspects, I know you've not been head of accessibility for many years, it's fairly recent, but when coming into that role, what are the aspects you sort of looked around and thought, oh, these aspects in this organization are good, and is a demonstration of how capable it is?
Sure, yeah, thanks for inviting me on this today, Alastair. When I joined GDS, which was about 4.5 years ago, it was under my predecessor, Al, who's now part of Nomensa. And part of my role was to try and build accessibility capability across teams, across central government mostly, obviously internally within GDS, Government Digital Service, but wider than that, because there's a lot of digital teams right across government. And we knew at the time that there was very limited capability. There were some pockets of expertise in certain departments. There were some accessibility experts around. There was a lot of expertise amongst certain developers, certain designers, but it was quite patchy, and we knew there'd be a lot of work to do. We actually did a discovery to find out exactly how big the scale of the thing was. And since then we've tried to do work around building capability through training, through guidance, through resources, and other aspects as well. So it was certainly the case that we knew there was some level of expertise there, but there was a lot of work to be done in that area. It wasn't, we weren't trying to get to the point where we have an accessibility expert in every team or anything like that. I don't think that's the way to go. Not a specialist, if you like. But we wanted to get across that it's everyone's responsibility. Everyone needs to know something about accessibility. Everyone needs to know what other people need to do, and that it needs to be built in from the start, not just at the end of a project. So not sort of typical waterfall type projects where you test things right at the end.
Yeah, and I guess because GDS is the sort of central organisation, for those not familiar, you're then working with lots of other government departments, aren't you? Sort of assisting them with their accessibility progress. Is that right?
Yeah. So if you think of things like Department for Work and Pensions, HMRC, and lots of other government departments, the main central government departments, we're working directly with them to help them understand what they need to do from an accessibility point of view, but also through looser links as well. So it is central government rather than local authorities and things like that. But obviously that's been expanded more recently.
And
How much?
Leonie, I know. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to ask Richard a question, if that's all right. I was curious how much that fragmentation across the different sort of departments has made it more challenging, because I think that's something a lot of organizations have to deal with, is many departments, different cost centers, different areas of responsibility.
It has been challenging. Obviously, individual government departments have quite a degree of autonomy, led by permanent secretaries. They have quite a lot of control over their own areas. They have to follow particular government guidelines, but we can't go around telling all the departments exactly what they have to do with everything. We can provide guidance. There are certain areas where they do have to follow GDS guidance around things like the government service standard. So it is complex. And also, you know, a lot of it is to do with the size of the organizations. You look at things like HMRC, that's a very big organization, or Home Office, but there's a lot of many smaller departments, organizations, arm's length bodies within government. There are hundreds, in fact thousands of smaller bodies within central government. They're not going to have the expertise. They also don't necessarily have the means to build up that expertise easily, or the time for that matter. So that's challenging, if you like, the size of the organizations and sort of separate nature of them.
Yeah. And Leonie, I was wondering, I know you've been involved with GDS previously, but whether you had any sort of experience with commercial clients and the sort of any, you don't have to name names, but anyone you would sort of hold up as a sort of good example of accessibility capability, particularly with what their approach was.
I always think Barclays is a good example. Not an organisation I've worked with directly myself, but knowing many of their accessibility team there, I think they've taken a pretty good approach to it. They've thought of the different angles, many of which Richard was just mentioning, you know, training, kind of changing sort of culture as well. And I think, you know, as a consumer, you know, as well as a professional, I think they've hit sort of several of the kind of sort of key notes, if you like, of putting in place a good level of capability.
Yeah, and I noticed from, I was at a conference a couple of years ago where there were talks from people like Facebook, and I've been to ones previously with BBC, and they tended to take, you know, so for example, I mean, Facebook is a big organization, and at the time, certainly their accessibility team, I think, was 3 people.
Yeah.
So it does seem to be kind of, most people take the approach of having a small kind of core team, if you like, and then trying to get some kind of network approach going of some sort of capability, expertise, but at least involvement from across their kind of different product teams. Has that been your experience? It
has, and I think there's a common risk with that approach, where the temptation is to try and achieve a lot very quickly. And organizations start with an accessibility team who initially have a remit to change practice, change culture, put in place processes, expand out a network, and get to the point that Richard mentioned of you know, it being everybody's responsibility. And then I think organizations tend to hit a bit of a realization that that's a long game to play. That's not a 3, 6, even 12-month project. It can take a long time. I mean, Richard, I think you said, you know, you've been looking at that, you know, in a concerted way for sort of 4 years or so. And I think then the temptation is for that accessibility team to suddenly become the accessibility expertise. And what happens very, very quickly after that is that you get a bottleneck, because you've effectively, you've brought, you know, the third-party agency internally, if you see what I mean, and I think that quite often trips organisations up, and then it doesn't work, and then they get disheartened, and it takes a little while for them to sort of regroup and rethink.
Yeah, and in terms of, I mean, I'll be upfront. Most organisations that get in touch with us haven't gotten particularly far in terms of increasing their accessibility journey, and.
Yep.
I mean, I have my own hobby horse on this, but why do you think, either of you, that is the case, that most organisations seem to be at square one whenever they get in touch?
I think there's been a distinct lack of awareness of this, even though it's, you know, accessibility guidance, the regulations, the web content accessibility guidelines, all those sort of things. The Equality Act, at least, have been around a long time now, the Disability Discrimination Act. But there's been a distinct lack of awareness. Previously I worked for commercial organisations as well, and it was just the same, the same there. And I think it's more so in the commercial sector that there is a lack of awareness. It's also, I think, something that's been highlighted with the new public sector accessibility regulations is that people take notice when there is a penalty, unfortunately. So the stick is having an effect. And if you look back a couple of years to GDPR regulations, everyone took notice of that pretty quickly because of the massive fines involved in that. So I'm not a big fan of making the stick the most important thing, but it does seem to be having an effect.
I've got a suspicion that a lot of organisations, a lot of people see accessibility as quite discrete projects. You might get something assessed or audited for accessibility. You might have some usability testing done with older people with disabilities, but they tend to be very small, quite sort of set pieces. And to really put capability into an organisation, accessibility capability or any other kind, it's got to be sustainable, and it's not a small undertaking. And I think if organisations have gone into trying to change something as fundamental as the way they do accessibility, and have attempted it as a kind of short, discrete piece of work, having someone come in, write them a strategy, write them some processes, some nice policy documents, taking those and actually implementing them and making them happen, that's the hard part. And I think that's the bit that a lot of organizations come unstuck on is, you can take the first steps, but actually making the change is hard work, and you need help to do that quite often. Even if there are people who are really enthusiastic, really get it inside the organization, actually trying to turn the tanker from the inside is not an easy task, and I think quite often it gets underestimated.
I think another issue that I've seen is that in the agile world where project teams come and go very quickly, expertise can get lost, but also just the turnover in the industry is quite high. In the digital industry is quite high, particularly if you think about London or the southeast or whatever. So it means there's a constant turnover. If you're losing 1 in 4 of your staff every year, then you've got to make sure you keep building up that expertise, which is also highlighted by the fact there isn't much in the way of education through secondary and tertiary education. There just isn't there, so people aren't coming in with the expertise, and it's kind of impossible to say. Unfortunately, it's impossible to say, we're hiring a developer, you can only come in if you've got expertise in the web content accessibility guidelines or such like, because we know that's unrealistic in many ways. It's a preference, but we're not at that stage in terms of maturity, if you like.
Yeah, I would point to education as being one of the biggest factors, because accessibility isn't included in sort of standard design or front-end development kind of engineering courses. It's not something people have when they come. I mean, I've done probably in the thousands of training sessions now, and I always ask at the beginning who's had any previous experience, and it's maybe 1 in 10 who've had any previous experience. And in terms of people, obviously, because if I'm running training, people who know a lot about accessibility don't tend to come to that training, but occasionally you do get somebody who's worked at the BBC or one of these other organizations that places a heavy emphasis on accessibility, and but it's like maybe 1 in 10 on a good day. And that actually makes it to some extent the organization's responsibility. So you just have to assume that the people coming in don't have experience. That needs to be your default assumption. Otherwise, as I think Richard was saying, people drift away. Whatever was done in a particular project is not going to last that long.
And I think that's another. Sorry, go ahead.
So I say it's interesting what you talk about. So when you say about training, one of the things I've found is in talks and training, it's got to the stage now where I don't need to create a lot of new materials because I'm covering the same stuff and again and again. And I start to think, is this for real? Do people still need to know this really basic stuff? And the answer is yes, they do in a lot of cases. Yeah. Sorry, Leonie, I interrupted you there.
That's right. I was thinking, I think that's another thing that organizations often do, is that it's often about the people, the individuals. You get a handful of people who are really passionate, really enthusiastic about it. But, as you say, churn happens, those people leave, and quite often they can take the expertise with you. So I think another important thing that has to happen is that this has to become institutional, has to become sustainable, not about individual people who you can name, but it actually has to become about a framework, a whole architecture of processes, practices, so that it doesn't really matter who comes in, who goes. You've got that sort of framework in place to sustain the capability.
Yeah, and there's, one of the sort of, even though I'm one of the people that sort of edits the WCAG guidelines, that should be considered a baseline. It's not where I start when I'm doing training as well. I cover it, but it's not the kind of starting point. I've always found it much more effective when people are designing in from the beginning. I was wondering, Leonie, have you come across sort of good things to do in an organization to get people thinking in that way?
Yes, like you, training I give tend not to dwell on sort of laws or guidelines very much. We mention them because they're relevant, but actually helping people identify things that they can fix and improve, and then by the end of the training, having them go away with the sense of actually we've accomplished something here. I've learned how to use a new tool, or I've spent some time and I've spotted some things in the app or the website or the voice assistant application I'm working on, and I've if not actually made some concrete improvements to that thing, I've got a pretty clear idea of what I can do when I get back to my desk tomorrow to start doing it. So focusing much more on the practicalities of it, if you like, the sense of satisfaction that you can get when you've made a step in the right direction, fixed a problem, made some kind of improvement. And I think making it role specific as well. There's a lot of very good introductory training out there, I'm singing to the choir here, speaking to both of you two, but I think it's really important, to get down to what's important to developers as opposed to designers, content editors, experienced designers, because there's so much to think about. And back to Richard's original point about it being everyone's responsibility. If we're really going to make that the case, then I think training has got to fit everybody, individually based on their role.
Yeah, I'd echo that because.
Sorry, quick comment from the chat. Apparently my mic is too low, so I'm going to get closer, and Leonie's is a bit too loud. I don't know. Leonie seemed to sort of crank up a little bit just after we started, so maybe just move it slightly away.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Sorry about that. Audio is wonderful things. Training, customizing training for different roles, for different people is obviously going to be helpful, although not always done. Are there any other sort of things you've seen in organizations? Richard, I know the GDS, I'm going to get the wrong term, not the service manual, but the sort of component library that is part of the resources. I've noticed when we do accessibility audits for sort of government departments, when they have used that component library well, it's much quicker, easier thing to test. It's tends to fly through. You're catching a few little bugs rather than what we normally get, which is wholesale lack of keyboard accessibility or something like that. Has that, from the inside point of view, has that been a successful sort of approach?
Yeah, I think it's been a massive success, actually. It's built from previous iterations through things like WCAG elements. I'm sure Leonie was part of building that component library, if you like. But this kind of more formalized it into a design system, and that's been built on by other organizations as well. So NHS, for example, modeled their design system on the GDS design system. It's been a real success because it enables people to have some assurance that there is accessibility capability built into the components they're using. We do emphasize, of course, that it doesn't mean you're going to produce an accessible service just by using these components, but it's a good start. Saves you a lot of time. As Alastair Duggan always used to say, you get a lot of accessibility for free with these things. And it's best practice, and it's evolving all the time. Obviously it was audited against the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.1, and as the sort of 2.2 version of the guidelines is being drafted, and that we're thinking about how we're going to make that work with the design system and some of the complexities around that. So it's been really valuable, and with COVID as well, it's obviously enabled us to spin up some services pretty fast. You know, some of the early services were launched within about 3 days, which, you know, would be much more difficult to do without those things in place, and you know, and to still have the confidence that there's a good degree of accessibility in there. You know, there's a lot of work that has to be done on top of that, but I think it's been really, really useful.
Mm. And I think
go ahead.
thanks. Teaming up the components that are in the design system with good documentation, so that not only are the building blocks themselves accessible, but when someone comes to use one of those, they've got some, you know, built-in help on what to do, what not to do with that thing to, you know, either sustain the accessibility or at least not break it, you know, once they use that component in an interface somewhere.
And it's become a more collaborative thing as well. You know, WK Elements was GDS really building these things with help from outside, but now it's become much more collaborative, and it's across all of government, but outside as well, that people come up with ideas or they create their own components. You know, it isn't that we're building these components to share with everyone. It's a collaborative effort.
Yeah.
And I found the same actually on the commercial sort of side. Several clients who have quite often publicly facing published kind of component libraries or that sort of thing tend to do a better job. And I think it's actually publishing it publicly seems to really help get that buy-in internally as well, to get different teams, because quite often you'll have one team's in charge of the component library, one team's in charge of this particular section of the website or the sales journey or whatever it is. So you have multiple teams, and getting everyone to use the same component library can be like herding cats. Does need some strong leadership there. I think possibly there's an advantage in government. It seems easier, although maybe that's just being good internal wrangling. But it has been helpful for commercial companies too. It just seems to be a little bit harder to get all the teams on board. That's just been my experience.
Yeah,
I think that's where you get something of a kind of culture clash internally within organizations. There's a higher up the system you get, there's an inherent reluctance, I think, to be public about anything. You know, we won't share this, we won't publish that, we won't open source anything. And I think that has a knock-on effect in accessibility terms as well. You'll hear very few organizations, you know, giving talks at conferences or meetups to say, look, you know, we've done this, we've tried that didn't work. We're not perfect, but, you know, we're on the way. And this is another one of the reasons I think Barclays has done a good job, is because they have, you know, been quite open about their successes where things haven't worked so much. And I think you're absolutely right. I think if more can be done in the open, whether it's component libraries or just talking about experiences that other people can learn from, I think that all has a very positive effect overall.
Yeah, and there's sorry, we are still getting a comment if Leonie can lower her mic volume, which I think probably just means move it away slightly or down.
I can try.
Maybe.
Okay, see how that goes.
Okay, and yeah, we're doing our best. Apologies. So yeah, I mean, I'm not saying people have to publish things publicly. It was just a case of that seems to get a bit more buy-in internally if you can, and get it a bit more used. I mean, the big difference is when you've got, say, you know, some organizations had 100 or 1,000 developers. If they're starting from a default accessible point, it makes a massive difference compared to 100 different ways that people have started off, you know, any particular type of component. Just that systemization, making things systematic, seems to work a lot more effectively from an accessibility point of view.
I think it's just more cost effective as well, because obviously it saves time, but it gives the teams more time to work on the more unique aspects of their service or whatever, that they can build their own components if they need to, and they don't have to spend all their time building the stuff that, you know, reinventing the wheel, if you like.
How about kind of internal support? So if you're in an organization are there any sort of internal support mechanisms you've seen work well?
We've tried to create an accessibility community. Again, this goes back to Alastair Duggan. He started the accessibility community in government, and when I joined, it was around about 300 people. It's now up to 1,300, and that's professionals across government, but not accessibility professionals necessarily. It's across all disciplines, and it's a whole group of people who have an interest in understanding how this works. And it's not just a case of us at GDS sending out broadcasts to say this is what you need to do. It's very much a sort of collaborative effort with cross-government meetups, sharing of ideas, and it helps from a sort of inclusion diversity point of view, because we can't provide all the best ideas from our very small team at GDS. We need the expertise and the experience of lots of people, lots of designers in particular, developers as well, who come up with new ideas, and that's how a lot of the design system came out, was, you know, input from the community, if you like.
Léonie, have you seen any sort of different approaches that have helped?
No, actually. The GDS community is remarkably successful, and I've seen it emulated in a lot of different places, you know, to similar effect. But I think if it achieves one thing, I think it's that it stops people doing the same thing in 6 different places across an organization, particularly in a big organization, you know, with lots of moving parts. That happens very, very easily. But if you've got a place where people can go and say, look, we're trying this thing, has anybody done it before? Or, you know, actually, oh, I noticed you were doing that, but here's something we made earlier. That's an incredibly powerful thing. And I think, yeah, it can make a really huge difference.
Yeah, and I don't think it's perfect, but it, you know, there are still things that go on that you think, well, haven't people already learned that information or stuff like that? And there's the same questions keep coming up again. But again, I think part of that comes around to this sort of turnover in the industry problem, that, you know, there's new people coming in all the time, and actually people are really willing to answer those basic questions. There are no stupid questions in the accessibility community. People are happy to ask them and answer them. And it's got to the level of maturity now where, as I say, as GDS, we don't have to answer all those questions. If you ask a question in the community, you'll get an answer within 5 minutes, which is really good.
And that sort of comes back to the idea of getting out of that bottleneck potential. You know, instead of having a small team who are trying to field questions from, you know, hundreds of people across, you know, dozens of teams, yeah. If you can build a kind of, you know, self-sustaining community that can help out, because people will learn, and you know, they will remember, and then they will quite happily share, which is one of the lovely things about it. It can help.
Yeah, and I mean, something slightly more formal that I've helped a couple of organizations with is just setting up a sort of internal working group with people from sort of across different teams, and sometimes it's by discipline, you know, design, somebody from design team, somebody from technical team, sometimes it's from product teams. But just meeting up once a month or so to talk through any issues that have come up, any new findings from testing or research that they've been doing, or updates to their kind of central resources like component libraries or kind of manuals and guidance and things. And sometimes it's, depending on the kind of organization, it can help to at least have that as a sort of mark in the diary for people to get some actions done, and communicate things out to the teams as well. So it gives you that sort of slightly more formal mechanism. Although, as Matthew Barnett said in the comments, the UK government digital Slack channel is an excellent place for support. Yeah, wish I could get on there sometimes. We have an internal, in Nomensa, we have an internal WCAG group, which is in this niche scenario that we have just discovered, does this pass or fail X guideline? You know, there's always more to learn. You know, I've been doing this for 20 years. There is still more to learn. And Richard, I think, was not far behind.
I think I'd echo that as well. We're still learning, and we're still sort of arguing about the niceties of some of the points, some of the interpretation of some of the web content accessibility guidelines still every day. Yeah.
As a colleague of mine said just a couple of days ago, if you ask 3 different accessibility people for their opinion, you'll have 9 different opinions.
Yeah.
Yep.
Let's tend to multiply up. We're all very good at that.
Yeah.
I've had a couple of questions we can start going through. I'm going to butcher somebody's name. Olani. Shouldn't there be some sort of guideline all companies, designers, developers, etc. should follow when it comes to accessibility? Or at the moment, there is a guideline. To me, it seems like everyone have their own accessibility style, like GDS. Ooh, does anyone want to tackle that one? I can go from a guidelines point of view.
Yeah, go on then.
Okay. So I mean, there is the web content accessibility guidelines from W3C. They do tend to be the baseline, or at least the starting point, almost everyone uses. So that is underlying the kind of EU directive. That is where the public sector guidelines came in. It's used in the US quite a lot as well. So, but I think what you're getting at is people tend to take that on and make it their own. And actually, I would say that's a good thing. Because they're designed to work across, hopefully every kind of website. It's a bit like E equals MC squared. It's a good physics equation, but it doesn't help you build a bridge. It's a case of it helps if you customize it for yourself. You build on it, take it as a baseline, but say how you do things. I mean, there's like pages and pages worth of guidance on doing headings and things like that. But actually, if you define in your templates how you do your headings, you can do that in a couple of paragraphs and a picture. It's not nearly as complicated as answering that question for every possible kind of website. So I would say, yes, that everyone has their own accessibility style. That should be a good thing. Any different answers to that?
No, but I will, very much echo the capability to simplify. As you say, WCAG has to deal with pretty much every eventuality that ever could be. But if you do adopt it as your own, you do have a huge opportunity to massively simplify that, and in doing so, hopefully make them, sorry about this, Alastair, but a bit more understandable for people who are coming to it for the first time.
And I think going back to what Leonie said earlier, that the different disciplines, they have different focus. Some of them only need to know certain aspects of it, and that helps certainly from a sort of training point of view, because you say to them, you say to people, there's 50 web content accessibility guidelines success criteria for at level AA and level AA. That can be a bit scary. Whereas if you say, these ones apply to content designers, these ones apply to developers, these ones apply to designers, it does help sort of make it a more manageable task as well.
Yeah, and I can talk about this because we did a talk about it publicly with NHS Digital, where we went through a kind of essentially a workshop exercise with various members of the teams. And we actually went through and worked out of the 50 guidelines, which ones would be applying to designers. And it was 17, came up with a pretty exact number. And that was actually the basis for their kind of equivalent of the service manual. And they've got an accessibility section with, if you're a designer, here are the things you need to know about. If you're a content designer, that was their term. And they had some interesting variations in roles between kind of graphic designers and front-end developers. But we split things down, worked out who was responsible for what, and that was the basis of that sort of content development, essentially. And just setting those responsibilities, which, as you say, just reduces how much you need to sort of read and need to know about in order to do your job well.
I think whilst there is loads of information in WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, about the understanding and the reasoning behind it, it does feel sort of difficult for people to get into that. So explaining the basics is always a good thing. Why accessibility is important, how it impacts people, the differences, how it affects people, whether it's permanent, temporary, or situation. All of those sort of things are big factors. How people work with assistive technologies, how disabled users access things through user research, user testing. All these are things that really build on that, if you like.
Ben Armstrong was asking, might it also be an aspect of delineation around software engineering role versus front-end engineer versus interaction designer? So there is not an owner unless there is an advocate. I think he asked that a while ago when we were talking more about the sort of organizational aspects. So yeah, who owns accessibility is an interesting question. It's something I tackle quite a lot in training sessions, and I ask the question, and there are usually three answers. One's the glib answer, everyone. One is the, I think the practical answer is usually whoever's in charge of the project. So product owner, product manager, something like that. And then hopefully there is somebody senior as well who can act as a point of escalation. But have either of you seen sort of interesting or useful cases where somebody owned accessibility that you didn't expect, or the more common case, I guess, where nobody does?
Yeah, that's definitely the more common case. I can't think of any completely outlandish examples of who owned it. But I think the question, and it often happens with accessibility, ask the question about another aspect of the product, and you tend to get the right answer, in the sense that, you know, the product manager is usually the one responsible for its, you know, quality, privacy, security. So adding accessibility in as another dimension to you know, product responsibility, I think makes complete sense.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen any odd examples either, but it's usually the case that everybody thinks somebody else has got more responsibility, if you like. You know, it's not often very well defined, and, you know, everybody thinks, yeah, they've got some responsibility, but nobody thinks they've got overall responsibility. I've been trying to, in terms of awareness of the regulations, I've been trying to tackle things from both ends, if you like, meeting with teams and the people who are creating this stuff, but also senior leaders, for them to recognise their responsibility in this, you know, even at the chief executive type level, that they have a responsibility to make sure their services, their information is available to as many people as possible in whatever means they need to use it, not just externally, but internally as well. So their employees as well. And that's a big challenge, if you like. So, you know, I see it as attacking things from both ends.
And that does make an extraordinary difference when you get it from, you know, bottom up, top down. I did a lot of work with Nationwide last year, and, you know, they took the decision pretty much at the highest level that they were going to, you know, change their accessibility capability. And no matter how much enthusiasm you've got, you know, across teams, practitioners, sooner or later you will bump into someone who's like, you know, this is not a priority for our team. We haven't got time, budget, knowledge, whatever. And at that point, it really does help when you've got someone higher up the food chain. Actually, no, as an organization, we are taking this seriously. We are going to make time, give knowledge, you know, make it happen. And I think that's when you get a really good level of success. You've got, you know, willingness from the teams and kind of authority, if you like, to make it happen from higher up the company.
Yeah, but it does have to be a sort of long-term thing, as you hinted at, Leonie, earlier. You can do this for a short time and make some good results, but in terms of building capability, this has to be a strategic thing. So that's really important. Yeah.
I had a question, from your experience, who or what makes a good accessibility designer? Which is a good, sort of a good question. I struggle with that slightly in terms of, would you have a specific accessibility designer?
I think in terms of designers generally, a good designer should be an accessible designer. Now, whether that's, you know, limitations of the education system or awareness that there aren't that many, I don't know. But designers always talk about, or some designers talk about, you know, it puts extra constraints on them if they, you know, for example, they have to work within a limited set of options for colors and things like that. But then, you know, other designers point out that design is always based on constraints. You have constraints on physical space or whatever, and so designing within constraints is what design is about. So doing it to make things work for everyone is it's just thinking about, you have these constraints. It still doesn't limit what you can do. It doesn't, we're constantly telling people it doesn't mean you have to have a text-only website or a black and white website or things like that. It's not about that. It's about following some basic rules that mean you can make things work better. If you take an analogy, you build a car, you don't build it with sharp edges, because we know from experience that's dangerous. But that does limit designers. You can't build a sharp-edged car, but that doesn't stop designers coming up with great designs.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think
might have a thing about that.
But it's true. Designers do work with constraints all the time. If you're a designer working on a Coca-Cola website, there's nothing you're going to do about that red come hell or high water. It is what it is. It's a constraint, a fairly big one. And I also struggle with the idea, if you have an accessible designer or an accessibility designer, and then your other designer, sooner or later, somebody's got to do the conflict resolution between the two different designs, which ultimately means you need somebody who's got knowledge of both aspects of design to bring it together. So you might as well just treat it as a single design effort from the get-go, I think.
Yeah, if you're talking about as a separate role, I didn't quite understand the question then. I definitely wouldn't want to go down that route of having somebody who's an accessibility designer or an accessibility developer, for that matter. It's just an anomaly. I mean, you could say initially they have some expertise, but then they have to build it up within the rest of the design team. It's just, you can't have one person doing that stuff.
Yeah, not a separate role. Okay, and Jack Craig asks, what can less mature organizations without designated accessibility experts do to keep up with changes in guidelines and technology?
I think one thing is there's a lot of resources out there now. There's a lot of good videos, things like Accessibility London. There's lots of talks where people can get to understand some of the basics of this. There's tons of resources, and if you're on Twitter, you'll find these sort of things quite quickly. Also, I also encourage people, in terms of trying things, is we built an accessibility empathy lab with laptops and things. You can do this with very basic equipment. You don't need even a laptop. You can use a basic Android phone to find out about accessibility using a screen reader, for example. You can find out about Zoom using just a browser. Any old browser, and so there's lots of things, or keyboard access, for example. They're simple things people can do. It's not rocket science in many ways.
Yeah, and I'd look around in whatever your organization is. Presumably you have communication mechanisms. I mean, how does the organization do things in terms of security or design or whatever other sort of topic you want to look at? How is that kind of knowledge distributed in the company, and set up something similar? Whether it's kind of show and tells at lunchtime or various other sort of whatever those mechanisms are. There must be something. Companies don't tend to work unless you can distribute knowledge internally in some fashion. So, and in terms of keeping up with changes in guidelines and technology, I'd be amazed if anyone thought the guidelines changed that quickly. The technology can change, but that's not really a quick thing, in my opinion. Maybe I'm too close to it, but the way people work doesn't generally change that quickly. So it's only things like CSS attributes and things like that can change over a period of a couple of years. So I don't know.
I think one area where things are changing quite quickly is in people's use of mobile. That's increased vastly over the last few years, and most of government traffic is now on mobile devices, and more use of, for example, voice recognition, that people use it just to type text and things, or more use of captions in videos because people don't want to hear the audio. So a lot of these things are becoming more mainstream. So I think that can help with understanding as well.
I'd say blogs are the other constant source of good information. And yeah, I've recently rediscovered using an RSS reader. So that's made collecting, articles from different good websites much easier. But Nomensa has a terrific blog. GDS has one. we don't at Tetralogical, though we do publish articles, but there's plenty of individuals, including Alastair and myself, who write, and many others from the profession and the industry. So there's a lot of good information, as well as the videos and other things that Richard mentioned before.
Yes, unfortunately, looking after the guidelines has more or less killed my blogging ability in the last couple of years, but
W3C will do that to you.
Not that much time in the day, unfortunately. Okay, so I think I've covered all the questions. Oh, sorry, one more. We already have access on multiple accessibility guidelines. I'm not sure what they mean by that. What, in your opinion, should not be consistent when designing a system in terms of accessibility? And do you have any examples of how companies might have misused guidelines in the past? Now, I think the first part of that question, what shouldn't be consistent when designing in terms of accessibility? I'm not sure I understand that question. If you're still there, anonymous attendee, it would be good to clarify that. In terms of how companies might have misused guidelines, I'm sure we've probably all got a story about that. So no one wants to take a crack.
Well, the obvious generic is every company that's ever used them to say what's the minimum we have to do not to get sued. It's probably one of the greatest misuses, I should think.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, yeah, and that is also another reason why you have to consider them as a baseline, because if people do get sued over them, it means that they're very cautious from that point of view. So it's always better to approach how you should design, how you positively design things for accessibility, rather than with that kind of fallback. I mean, another way I've noticed, almost in a positive way, people misusing guidelines is, I don't like this thing. What guideline can I get it to fail under? Which happens a lot, particularly from UXers, and in my opinion, that's very much a case of it's not very good from a usability point of view. That's your angle. It doesn't have to fail a guideline in order to change something. So that's something I've noticed.
I think one of the things I've noticed, not necessarily misused guidelines, but misunderstanding of guidelines, is that WCAG makes it clear that the guidelines say you've got to achieve this success criteria, but they don't say how you have to do it, and there can be multiple ways of doing that. And I think people sometimes get sort of stuck in the examples and things and think, oh yeah, and they actually sometimes quote things like techniques and things and say, well, it fails this because it doesn't do this particular technique, and you say, well, that's okay, but they may be doing it in a different way, or there are other ways to do it. So that's one of the ways, I think, where sometimes you have to think a bit carefully. And also it's easy to get bogged down in the guidelines sometimes and think, as you say, Alastair, that you're trying to fail something, find out which guideline it is. Unfortunately, that can be an issue sometimes. Something isn't accessible, but you want to work out which guideline it fails against, or it's bad experience. So there is a sort of case of trying to get away from being rigid about this is about the guidelines, and that's why we always say, as you said, this is a baseline, this is only a part of it, that there's a lot more to do, and technology just does change. The way the web works does change. Who'd have thought we'd have things like Twitter and YouTube and Facebook 20 years ago? They're all quite different ways of working compared to a traditional website, and who knows what's coming in the next few years.
Yes, although I would point out Twitter, Facebook, and mobile devices all more than 10 years old now. So they did take their time in actually coming along and changing things.
Yeah.
So, question from Scott Ace: do you have any examples when designing using accessible components does not convert as well as previous version? So I guess in terms of sales conversion or something. And how do you keep everyone on board that you're doing the correct thing? Has anyone come across components or presumably an accessible version of a design or a website that didn't convert as well as previously?
I don't know about converting, because obviously it's not necessarily what we're thinking about in government terms, but in terms of people completing tasks, I suppose, that sort of thing. We did find, for example, that the accessible checkboxes that we created and radio buttons we created were good and they were larger than the standard ones and they had a lot of advantages, but when people tried to do more complex things with them, like Miller columns and stuff with lots of examples, it became unmanageable. So that's one of the reasons why the design system has to be dynamic, and so they came up with smaller checkboxes and things like that to cater for those odd cases, if you like, where things don't quite work.
Yeah, I can't think of an example where changing the design or the components used has had a negative impact. Certainly on conversion rates. The one thing I can say is that in 25 odd years of working on the web, most of it in accessibility, I've never heard anybody complain that something was too easy to use or too accessible. So,
yeah, I mean, a lot of the case studies in the early 2000s were around improving conversion when you made things accessible. I can think there might be some cases where when you're doing a particularly complex widget and you think that's a positive kind of usability thing, maybe it's a type head find or some kind of like maybe editing interaction or something that can get quite swishy, and it seems more usable, but it is a good thing to track, because whenever we've been through that process, you usually work out, oh, well, it's not accessible for X and Y reason, and it doesn't work very well on touchscreen devices, or it doesn't work very well in a keyboard scenario that some of your maybe disabled or non-disabled customers are using. So we've always found it creates a more robust solution in general. So yeah, sorry, Scott, not thinking of anything offhand where it's been a negative on conversion. The second part of his question was, how do you keep everyone on board that you're doing the correct thing? It's like any sort of internal change, I think. It's just keeping it a constant iteration. So it's not one change, it has to be an ongoing process.
And I think encouraging people, enabling people to see that what they're doing is it's a thing to be proud of. It should be, changing that kind of perception that it's about doing each of our jobs and doing it well. That was something I always liked about the early days of GDS, was that it was everybody who was part of the first team and who came to join the team thereafter was just, this is just what we do. It's how we do it. To do something inaccessibly or, without thinking about accessibility, I would not think that I'd, done my job properly. And I think that can really help. That sort of coupled with, standing firm, trying to change anything, change is hard. We know this every time, to use Facebook as the example, every time they change their design, there's entire groups of people complaining bitterly about it because change is difficult. And I think there's a balance between, encouraging and inspiring people to do better, do more, do the right thing, and standing firm, when there is pushback, and saying, actually, as an organization, this is something that we are going to do. We are going to take it seriously. Yes, it's going to mean changing. Yes, you're going to have to learn some new things. Yep, that's going to be difficult for a little while, but we'll do what we can to support you. But at the end of the day, this is going to happen. Probably like parenting. I'm not a parent, so I probably shouldn't say things like that, but it strikes me as a bit of the same. You want to encourage, but sometimes you've got to stand firm and be a little tougher, perhaps.
Yes, yeah. And there's one last question. Liam Cumber has just come in with, and I think we'll wrap up. So Liam asks, and I think we'll get a couple of groans from the panel. Within our org, we are very over-reliant on PDFs, but do not have the content designer resource to convert the volume of content to HTML. Can the panel recommend any automated tools which can scrape PDF content and output it accessibly? I think the short answer is probably no. Yeah,
probably no. I mean, there are organisations that will do that sort of stuff for you, but there's a cost, obviously. I'm trying to tell people to tackle the underlying culture rather than try and tackle all the existing PDFs. Obviously, deal with essential PDFs as a higher priority, but I think the amount of work that's involved in fixing PDFs could be better spent on actually building a better workflow, a better environment to produce more accessible documents, HTML. Yeah.
Yeah, short of setting fire to all the PDFs and seeing how quickly people decide they need to build the HTML versions to replace them. The one suggestion I do have, and I will qualify this very clearly by saying I have no idea if it can do what you're asking, Liam, but try looking for a tool called Prints. It does some pretty good things with PDFs. I have a hunch it might be more about PDF creation than scraping, but for the sake of a bit of searching, it might be an avenue worth exploring.
Yeah, it's the only server-side tool I've noticed that does actually produce tagged PDFs.
Right.
But it is I believe it's either a server-side tool or kind of templating tool rather
Is
than
it?
scraping.
Okay. I had a feeling it might be, but yeah.
And one last question. That's interesting points. Thank you. We've been focused on this discussion largely on how to help teams, but how about those in the boardroom and others responsible for digital spend? Do they know what they need to do? Do they know their responsibilities and accountabilities? Taking Leonie's point, it's hard to turn the tanker around, but a cultural shift is pretty much impossible without top-down support. Do you know how that change was brought about at Barclays? Or I'll widen that to anywhere.
I don't know about the Barclays, but as I say, as I mentioned earlier, one of the ways I'm trying to tackle that is by meeting with senior management and talking about it. But it has to be at I was going to say at their level. I don't mean that in a patronising way, but in the sense that they're not going to have 3 hours or 4 hours to sit through an accessibility training course. They want a snapshot. They want a sort of nugget of information of what's important. I can train people in 15 minutes on the basics or half an hour. So I think it's getting that buy-in from talking to people at high levels of organisations. It is a cultural shift, and it is like other things. It takes a long time. And as I say, legislation helps in some ways, but that isn't the big answer. It's more about we're doing this for the right reasons. We want to make this work for everyone. It can be for business reasons as well, of course. I'm sure in Barclays' case, they've thought about the business case around this.
I think you're right. We quite often do an executive briefing on accessibility. It's not a workshop. It doesn't explain how to do accessibility. It's got none of the sort of practitioner, because someone at C-level, board level, doesn't really have time or inclination to know those things. What they do need to know is enough to be able to walk back into the boardroom and have that conversation with their fellow directors or the colleagues there, why it's important to the organization, what they've got to do right from the top. And that's a very different approach to talking to teams, designers, developers and the like. It's a different audience, different messaging, different kind of information.
Yeah, and it segues nicely into kind of wrapping up, because I think getting that sort of buy-in is actually one of the first challenges, first things to do in terms of upping the maturity level, and getting into being a more capable organization from an accessibility point of view. And then it's education, it's maybe setting up a working group, it's working on your kind of internal resources, like your design and component type things. And the one last thing I would say is procurement. For the love of God,
Yes.
go and talk to your procurement people and make sure they are asking any third parties, any agencies, anyone who is contributing to your digital interface needs to be meeting the same level of accessibility that you are aiming for. Otherwise, that is a massive hole. And sorry, I waited right to the end to mention that one. But
and to prove that they've done it. I mean, I've worked with both of you long enough to know we've all experienced a situation where a third party has said, yes, we can do this thing to this level of accessibility, and has done nothing of the sort. But unless you have language in your contract that puts the onus of responsibility of having some independent verification that the standard has been met, then the cost invariably comes down to you as the commissioner, and that's not a good situation.
Yeah, that's got to change. It's a long-term thing, and I think it's also about educating the suppliers, if you like, about what accessibility is, because a lot of them just don't know what this means. Yeah.
And with that, I think we should wrap up. But thank you very much to Leonie and Richard.
Thank you.
And all three of us are on Twitter and At least Leonie and I are available for consultancy. Richard has his hands full with GDS. But yeah, hopefully people found that a useful panel. And thanks for everyone for coming along.
Thank you for asking me.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for listening, everyone.